Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 22nd, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today, we're joined by Bindu Sundaresan, your practice lead for AT&T Consulting Services, that is Security Consulting Services. And Bindu, welcome.
Thank you.
And tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So I'm part of the security consulting practice offered by AT&T, and I've been doing this for 16 plus years, and I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering and a master's in telecommunications. Then I started working on networks and then got interested in information security, and from then on I've been working with clients, helping them with strategies, as well as tactical solutions for security challenges.
That's very good. Two things. One, I'm a big advocate of the engineering. I just happen to be an engineer myself, so well.
Thank you.
It's good to meet folks of similar background. And I think the second thing is, you pointed out, you were working in networks and then transitioned into cybersecurity. I know a lot of folks have been working and doing that. Do you have any thoughts about how people should be thinking about doing it?
Yeah, so I think in the security space, it's a unique space because you can use your mathematical background, your analytical skills, your engineering background in terms of thinking through a problem and arriving at solutions. So the way I started out was the need to be able to problem solve, the need to want to innovate, while at the same time I like the people interaction, which is why the consulting element, right? So that's how I started, and I'm seeing more and more of colleagues that I meet with that come from sort of similar backgrounds, but at the same time a stronger skill set or a niche area that they focus on, and as a team we bring together collective brains and thought power behind what I consider to be a people problem today in terms of security. So.
Yeah, well, that's very good. We're going to talk a little bit about the people factor a little bit later on. So welcome again.
Thank you.
We have Joe Harten here. Welcome, Joe. And you're a director. You work on our enterprise security analysis platform.
Right, yeah, my team, we build the platform, so we're collecting and running analytics on the data. I just have a little bit of a different background. I'm more of a computer science and software background, and somewhere along the line you kind of fall in love with the data rather than the code, and getting to understand security data and the threats and the this sort of the security world we're in, just you end up pushing yourself more towards the domain and less towards the software end of it.
I guess perhaps a subtle point is that in order to do good security, you have to do good system design, platform design.
Absolutely.
And so it's not just about the analysis, it's not just about saying something about security. You actually have to build things to support it. So.
Right, yep. And we kind of have the infrastructure in place in order for brilliant people like yourself and Jim to find all the problems. So.
I have more brilliant days. All right, thanks, Joe. I'll take the compliment anyway. And then we have Jim Clausey online. Welcome, Jim. And actually, I tend to think of you as a security and forensics analyst as a part of our organization. So welcome, Jim.
Thanks. Yeah, it's good to be here. It's interesting that my background was math and computer science, double major as an undergrad, and then a master's in computer science. But I've been all over the place doing system administration, database administration. I built compilers for a while, and then I got into the malware analysis and forensics.
So actually, another good attribute, and the reason I'm kind of digging into this a little bit is I just happened to have been discussing with a colleague of ours today. He was interested, he has a very strong background in engineering, software engineering, and in program management, interested in getting the cybersecurity space. And so, Jim, you point out another very important attribute is that hands-on aspect of things. There's no, even in system administration, you really get a very strong perspective of how to make pieces of an overall system secure, and it's a very important part of it that, I think one of my sort of slogans in the past has been, in security, the details matter.
Yes.
And so the administrator is the one that really gets into the details, and not to be lost on doing analysis on system forensics and malware analysis, same sort of thing. So welcome, Jim. And so let's get to it. Bindu, we talked a little bit about
Yeah.
the human factors here. So tell us a little bit about this perspective.
Sure. So recently I came across a study from NIST. It was released in the beginning of October, again, Cybersecurity Awareness Month and so on. So, this study was interesting. Although it's not a representative sample of an entire population, or, it's not really, something in terms of a statistical find, but more in terms of addressing a problem that they've uncovered, even without asking those specific questions. So what they found in this study is the security users, or the generic user population, is now tired of listening to the whole FUD tactic in terms of all the breach news, in terms of all the things that they have to do to make sure data is protected. The interesting angle to this that I thought was, we are now seeing a variety of attacks that target this specific weak link, which is the human element in the overall security. Whether it's phishing attacks that we are seeing business email compromises happening, all of that is targeted at that end user. So if the generic user population is going to be so frustrated about following security practices and keeping up the security hygiene, we as a security professional, while we are developing these measures, whether it is in the form of authentication tools, whether it's in the form of training programs, we really need to consider, what the end user is. I always say this: security is nothing if it cannot be functional, right? So user functionality and security go hand in hand. So there are, specific quotes from people that took this study that talk about how security is so cumbersome and they have to remember, 20 passwords. And the dilemma is, how do you enable this user to have a social profile, to be able to use different technological elements, and at the same time equip them so that they don't have to make hard security decisions. One of the things that this study points to is this is a psychological human problem. So if you consider the younger generation of today using all of the devices that we use, and if password, basic security measure, if that is going to be frustrating for an end user, imagine this is the generation that is going to come into the workforce tomorrow. So how are we going to equip our security measures, tools and technologies to address this human factor?
Yeah, I think you make some good points here, I guess, as a part of this study. Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that NIST made a publication like this, because it really, from my perspective, or my, I guess, past perspective of NIST, it's really been sort of a shift. And I think it is good that they're doing research in this area so that we can start thinking about how the security standards need to follow that and how the implementations need to follow it. And you pointed out, 20 to 30 passwords. I think we were talking a little bit earlier. I saw that and I had to check, and I have, I personally have like around 165 passwords that I have to maintain. And if you think about it, bank accounts, email accounts, it's both work and personal activities. And so we need to think about that in the context of tools. There would be no way for me personally to manage those passwords effectively if I weren't using a tool to help manage those passwords, that is to have and then protect them properly. And I think there was actually I've forgotten the context. Somebody had said that they had and an email kept their passwords.
All the passwords, I've walked into a number of places where, yes, they have a different password for each system. So at the end of the day, they write it on a piece of paper and then put it in a file cabinet, hoping to lock it each time. But we all know, right? How many times do we actually go about locking all of this? And we're also seeing, we have a tendency to use the same password across multiple, accounts. So especially
it's
email.
It's tempting to do that.
Yes,
it is tempting to do it.
Yeah, and unless I've said this before. First thing you can do is think of what a strong password is. The reason you cannot remember all of this is because you're also convoluting the process of creating a strong password. Mother's maiden name. I've seen people that mother's maiden name today I can find out just by Facebook, right? You're interfacing with people, you're sharing information, and those are the things that really get us into trouble long term.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting you point that out, because I was actually in a registering for a service recently, and it was compulsory that you choose answers to questions, things. Now, I think the recommendation on this is just make up something and then document what the answer is, as opposed to actually answering, because the questions were all ones that you could basically go into regular history, where did you live What school did you go to? Things like
Exactly,
that.
yeah.
It was really kind of silly questions.
Yeah, and what I usually do is, like you say, think of the most random answer. And yes, do I replicate those random answers? I do. But my password is not the same, right? And it's
Yeah.
not easy to find that. So.
Yeah, I recently went through the same effort where I got an update that one of my passwords was, lost. So I went and changed everything, and it annoyed my wife more than me, because she said, all the shared passwords were changed, and it made me think that anytime I change my passwords on any account that we share, she has a login, I have a login. If she has a weak password, it's just the same as me having a weak password. So really having to educate anybody else who sort of shares your access, that's important too.
Yeah.
So
since we're talking about passwords, I have to kind of go back and re-emphasize, and Brian Krebs made this a very clear point as basically an annex to his book on Spam Nation, is that be very careful about your email password. That's probably the most valuable password you have, because almost everything
It's connected to
allows
that.
you to reset
Yeah.
your password using your email account.
and that and your password manager password.
Yes, that's true. But
That's why you use two-factor authentication for the password manager.
good point, Jim. So Bindu, we talked about the passwords. What about some other aspects of this?
Yeah, so security awareness and training programs that we help people understand why they should take care of information, why should they go about protecting information. We see that effectiveness of a security awareness and training program is usually not measured, right? So we've all been there and done that in terms of training materials that is not really directly related to our job, that we sort of skim through. We get, again, back to the user fatigue in terms of frustration about why we need to sit through loads of training. I've often found this, HR policies and things that you're reading that you don't really apply on your day-to-day, job level, getting frustrated with that. So we are seeing that, the trend to check the measure of effectiveness that these training programs have on your user base. One of the ways to do that is social engineer your own, user population. And I've seen, more often than not that, that test reveals deficiency in your training program. It also helps the user understand the relevance and the impact a security threat might have on their own work style, right? So that is, one of the trends that's also mentioned in the study, talking about, why we need to develop training programs with the psychology of the user in mind. Talk to them about impact, not necessarily the threat itself, right? We want to know what the risks are and what the impact is, and don't give them, too much information in terms of boring them with the process of how that attack could happen to them. Give them information on how that attack will impact their job today. How will it impact, their kids, their lifestyle overall. So that, and once we make it personal, I think it also sticks better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Making it personal, and I think one of the things that we've been doing with our user awareness training is putting in the very small chunks.
Yes.
That is to teach one concept, and just take a few minutes doing that, and then to be able to move on and then and do others at other periods of time, I think is a helpful approach to doing it.
And our Murray videos are awesome, right? For the security awareness. So
I mean, our
Murray
team
always gets to be the victim.
yeah.
Yeah, our team has worked pretty hard on sort of making it fun. They, with Murray, and they've made like a video game of finding bad URLs. So they're trying to remove the boredom factor, I think, which can be there when you're just watching training videos.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you mentioned the measuring the effectiveness of that. I know there are some organizations, we certainly do it, doing tests using phishing emails to see how performance improves over time, and I think the user awareness programs have been helping with that. I think would be another sort of interesting test, and I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but the notion of, say, just tell the employee base we're at an elevated threat level, and see if they behave any differently, then okay, now we're back to normal threat level, and then sort of do another test and see if they...
Yeah, that would be interesting. Usually when we do these social engineering tests, it's amazing to see you don't tell them obviously that you're going to test them. You pick a random population across different roles, right? And one of the things that I've interesting to see is the C-level is usually never part of these awareness trainings. They're not required to take all of these CBTs. And that is what the hacker community tends to target as well, right? So, when we've social engineered, the folks in the finance department, in the call center, it'd be interesting to see the, variations in the results that we see. So we would assume that the call center folks are the ones that didn't know enough about security and they're divulging information. Not necessarily the case. In the CFO team, we have people where the sense of urgency is the success of a phishing email, right? So if I send over an email saying in the next 30 minutes, our CEO wants this list of data, chances are we are going to say, hey, it's part of our job, right? We need to get on this and give it to them.
There'll probably be 100 people working on it.
So that is usually what we found when we do these tests. And it's interesting how learning happens. Like I was talking to one of the cognitive science professors earlier that told me that the way we teach our kids today, the way we learn definitely has to change, because we no longer have the time, and again going back to the smaller bits, right? And the way we process information is so different. We almost want it to be a whiteboarding session sort of in front of us, right? So that's so while we create these awareness programs, I think that is key. So.
Okay, all right, very good. I think that's a really cool topic. So let me ask one additional question. What do you think? Do you think folks have become basically dismissive? That is, look at all these breaches that are going on. It's completely outside of my control. Yes, I have good passwords, but I give up.
Yeah, and I think that is quite a bit of that mentality across the generic user population. But on the flip side of it, we are seeing that all of these breaches has raised the awareness from a business side. So we are seeing that earlier I would work with small business customers who would not really understand how they play in the big security game, right? So why am I concerned? Why would the hacker pick me? I'm too small. But now we are seeing with all of the breaches that are happening that there is a shift on the business side. Yes, there is frustration on the consumer side. And as an average consumer, you're always looking for sort of shifting the blame above you and to some other authority figure that's going to take care of this problem for you. And that's, I think, what was revealed in this study, that I do all of this and I'm supposed to take care of all of this, but what about that retailer that is losing my data? What about this hospital that lost my data? And I think we're seeing both sides of the shift there. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that perhaps isn't addressed really clearly enough is who the liability really falls upon. Is the tendency is to talk about credit card owners as being the victim of credit card theft. It's actually not the owner that becomes the victim there. It's actually the banking and the retail organizations that become the victim because they have to basically recover. And I think that's, from my point of view, that's been sort of a sigh of relief. Not from my occupational point of view, but from a personal point of view, I'm not concerned about my credit card being lost.
And the interesting angle to this as well, right? You see news splashes. We talk about a certain entity being breached. We talk about all the damage that has happened to them. We talk about their stock prices falling. When was the last time we really spent all that attention on that hacking group that did it? So the victimization is a bit off here, where the victim, which is that entity that lost data, is not really looked at on a nicer light, versus we have completely forgotten what caused this, or who did this. Right? So.
All right, very good. All right, so let's go over to you, Joe, and we'll talk a little bit here. The Akamai quarterly report, I think it's the third quarter 2016 report came out. They call it the State of the Internet, and I always find it to be an interesting report. It provides some good context and the types of things that we see and even report on here. So,
yeah, more than anything, I think we just wanted to let folks know that it's out there, to go sign up for it, get a look at it. They do a pretty good job of sort of comparing this quarter to the previous quarter, and also last year. I think the more dramatic results are when you compare 2016 to 2015. I think they're over 100% greater DDoSes, and the amount of DDoS that we're seeing mostly from these IoT devices that we talk about seemingly every week. It's just stark from last year to this year. It's not as dramatic from quarter to quarter. I think they actually found that last quarter was 8% greater in total DDoSes to this quarter, but the annual statistics are pretty jarring. couple cool charts they had. One broke out DDoSes by industry, and really it's sort of a theme in this quarter report is that the DDoS attacks on Krebs on security, they happen to be within their block. So basically all the attacks on Krebs sort of dwarf the rest of the activity in the report. And he had 2 separate DDoSes on his site, bigger than anything they've ever seen. So I mean, I'm sure we talked about it earlier, but just to kind of understand the context of what everything else is getting in terms of attacks versus what Krebs saw, it's noticeable. And then they actually did a chart of all the DDoSes on Krebs' site over time from I think 2013 to current, and he's been getting DDoSed in some fashion or another for pretty consistently. Which just shows you that this awareness that we're talking about, somebody like Brian Krebs who's bringing awareness to some of these things, he makes himself a target. So,
yeah, and to your point, for anybody that's not familiar with Krebs on security, he has a regular, I think he pretty much blogs on topics pretty much daily. And but he certainly has, he's a traditional investigative reporter that happens to report on cybersecurity, which is, I think, relatively unique. The tendency is a lot of the folks that report on cybersecurity are cybersecurity practitioners, whereas he kind of gets out on the streets. He'll go and visit and actually interview with folks that are suspicious or have been suspected of particular activities. I think his Spam Nation book is very, one of the most entertaining reads that I've encountered, and the even though it's still a nonfiction, it's based on factual information, but he reports on things that sometimes perturb the folks that are conducting these attacks, and consequently he becomes a victim of the attacks, not infrequently.
Yeah, well, as a good investigative reporter, he's developed sources, and he manages to find stuff on these dark websites that I wouldn't have any clue how to find, but he does a great job of finding them, and he reports on them, and in turn makes himself a target.
Yep, that's absolutely true. I happen to be on a panel. It was moderating a panel, and Brian Krebs was on it, and there were some other representatives there. I think the director of science and technology for FBI was on the panel as well. And we were just getting ready to go up and sit down on the panel, and Brian ran out of the room, and it was actually somebody was conducting an attack on his site, and then he finally came in just at the nick of time to be able to get started with the panel, so it all worked out well. Nevertheless, I kind of got off on a tangent on the Akamai report. I think it's a very valuable report to take a look at, get an idea of the things that are going on, but also take into account that Akamai is in a particular area of business where they're hosting websites. They might not see the full demographic of activities. So for example, in the reporting that we're doing here, we see a lot of reconnaissance activity. Actually, they usually sort of report on some of that because their addresses are exposed to it. And then we also see activity where the denial of service attacks aren't just against websites, but they might be against others, individuals, in fact. Video gamers that are attacking each other just to get a leg up on each other. So it is, I think, complementary to the type of reporting we get here. And so, Bindu, let's get back to you here. And on this one, I think just another topic that's, I think, relatively new for NIST to be getting into.
Yes, so NIST traditionally, focused on, critical infrastructure, federal, defense type frameworks and guidances. And what we're seeing with NIST, when NIST released the framework in 2014, which was about the cybersecurity framework, very phased approach to managing critical infrastructure. What we saw amongst our clients as well is, how do I, in the private sector, take this framework, which seems to be very detailed, and apply it within my environment? a couple of years later, we are seeing that SMBs, the small and medium businesses, are targets of attacks today. They are sort of linked in the supply chain. They're part of, many regulations that impose, specific requirements, even though you're an SMB. You could be a cloud service provider servicing a healthcare customer. You're part of the HIPAA regulation that you need to comply with. You could be in the retail space and, you might be a service provider for a large retailer. You're bringing in yourself into that standard or into that industry regulation. So we see that this guide from NIST, which was released a couple of days ago, really is the basics or the fundamental approaches for SMBs to take a look at security overall. What was interesting to see in this SMB guide, typically when frameworks are laid out for you, you're not told how to actually go about doing the steps recommended. For example, most security professionals will come in and tell you, you have to start with doing a risk assessment. So how do I actually do that risk assessment? You have to know what your crown jewels are. Easier said than done, right? So how do I go about?
Especially when you only have one computer in your company.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and you're looking at one IT person that has to sort of implement all of these standards and guidelines and best practices. How do you go about doing something like that? What was interesting in this guide to see was they have it broken down by the steps of the framework. They have specific tool recommendations, almost up to the point of it sort of being a manual for you to sort of go through step by step. And they also have templates that tell you how to do a risk assessment, how should you enforce policies, how do you, calculate what is the risk to your asset, what is defined as a critical asset. Again, this is meant for the SMB space, the smaller physician's office, the smaller, providers that we see out there. But what is also good to, go through this guide, even if you're not a small business, is to also look at all their must-have recommendations, which I thought were spot on in terms of, taking a layered approach, knowing, figure out what is the low-hanging fruit, address them, and not everything needed a capital investment, right? So you don't need to go buy tools for every single area. There are things that you could do in-house, and it was an interesting, way for NIST to sort of reach out, to the small and medium businesses and sort of bring them into the cybersecurity, curve. Right?
So, based on your read of this, small to medium businesses, where do you see, how big of a business do you see this fitting into?
The NIST definition of this is, it's about, 500 individuals or less, both profit and non-profit. But the way I see it, right, these small and medium businesses are, I would define it as folks that don't have a dedicated security team, have a multifunctional IT team, have some sort of sensitive information to protect, are servicing, let's say, a regulated industry. They might not be heavily regulated, but they might be servicing a heavily regulated industry. And truly today, I'm seeing this as a competitive differentiator. So do I want to do business with somebody that has taken care of the basics of security and a due diligence, or do I want to place my bets on somebody that really is not really concerned about security, but is promising me a great quality of service? So security has to sort of come into that, service fabric, and it's part of what you're providing to somebody.
Okay, so if your IT department, your cybersecurity person, and your building security and your HR department are one person, this is probably a good reference.
Good, point of reference to start with. So.
Yeah, okay, very good. And thank you for highlighting that, because I think a lot of folks are really struggling with this topic and trying to figure out how to do it. So this is a guide that is really NIST's interpretation of the cybersecurity framework to help.
Yeah, and how do you apply it to a small and medium business? By using the same structure that we are familiar with as part of the cybersecurity framework. So.
Okay, very good. With that, that's our show for today. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attThreatTraq@list.att.com, and you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel, YouTube, and iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATDBusiness. And I'd like to thank you, Jim, for joining us today. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Bindu.
Thank you.
It's very, very much a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you.
And I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.